Hello, and welcome to the Aegon Air live stream with Nicole Alexander. I'm Gia Mirando, Director of Marketing here at Data IQ, and I'm excited to be joined by Nicole as she discusses the continued move to explainable AI and how organizations can weave it into their greater AI strategy. Thanks so much for joining us today, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me. Much appreciated.
So before we dive into Nicole's talk, I want to share a bit about her many accomplishments. Nicole is a professor of marketing and technology for NYU and an analytics lecturer at Columbia University. She was most recently SVP, Chief Innovation Expert for Ipsos, helping companies develop their innovation from brand strategy to product and service development so that they can develop the next big thing faster. She has 17 years across marketing, innovation, strategy, and analytics, including industry and academia, and has been a speaker at a number of industry and nonprofit events on the topics of innovation and leadership, explainable AI, data privacy, and the social impact of technology. So I know you are all eager for the main event. So Nicole, I'll pass the floor on to you.
Wonderful, Gia. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us for, I believe this is Aegon Air's first airing for 2021. So I'm very excited to talk to you all about the continued move to explainable AI. So today, in the time that we have, I wanted to go over three specific areas. First, talking a little bit about what is explainable AI. What do we mean when we talk about it? What's the motivation for implementing it within your organization? And even being a champion for that implementation in your company. And then looking at an ethical framework or guideline for what trustworthy AI is, what we mean by that, and how to go about the process of the actual execution, really thinking about ethics, fairness, and the questions that you should be asking specifically when you are building, revamping, or procuring an AI software. So first, let's talk a little bit about explainability. So in its simplest form, explainable AI, I would say, is a set of capabilities and methods used to describe an AI model, its expected impact, and any potential biases it may have. So these features usually help to identify the model accuracy, overall fairness, transparency, and both predicted as well as unpredicted outcomes. So when we think about explainable AI, it's crucial to promote trust as well as transparency when putting AI models into operation in society. And looking through that lens is what we're going to talk about today. So at its core, explainable AI aims to address how black box decisions of AI systems are made. So explainable AI can be summed up as a process to understand the predictions an ML model will make. The central idea is to make the model as interpretable as possible, which essentially helps in testing its reliability and causality of features. So broadly speaking, there are usually two dimensions to interpretability. The first is explainability, or why did the model do that? So asking questions like, why did the AI system make a specific prediction or decision? Why didn't the AI system do something else alternatively? The second dimension is around transparency, which I'm sure you've talked a lot about in your organizations. You hear a lot of news around transparency. So how does the model work? So simply put, it's questions such as, when did the AI system succeed and when did it fail? When do AI systems give enough confidence in the decision that you can trust it? And how can the AI system correct any errors that may arise? So specifically building in and looking at feedback loops. So typically, explainable AI systems provide an assessment of model input features and identify those features which are the driving force of the model. Essentially, it gives us a sense of control as we can then decide if we can rely on the predictions of the model or if we need to take in other factors into account. So for instance, we would all probably trust a flu identification model more so if it considers features like temperature, cough more significantly than it would possibly other symptoms. So really just having that explainability and that transparency. So I want to talk a little bit about motivation. So what's the motivation for any organization to implement explainable AI, or ensuring that is responsibly built into the AI, in case you may be procuring versus building in-house? So nowadays, if you think about machine learning models, they're pretty much ubiquitous, and becoming a part of our lives more than ever. So they're finding their way into a broad range of industries, which we hear about every day, such as hiring, lending, criminal justice, healthcare, and education. The resulting personal and professional implications of that are far-reaching. So we see that the sorts of decisions and predictions being made by AI-enabled systems are becoming much more profound, and in many cases, particularly in the health industry, critical to life, death, and an individual's personal wellness. So this dominant role played by AI models in these domains have led to a growing concern regarding potential biases, which we talk a lot about. But again, we talk about it, but they still need to be addressed. And a demand for model transparency and interpretability. So additionally, model explainability is a prerequisite for building trust, adoption of AI systems, particularly when you think about high-stake domains, really requiring reliability and safety, such as the healthcare field, automated transportation, and critical industrial applications, which have significant economic implications like predictive maintenance, exploration of natural resources, all the way to climate change modeling. So we see that there's a lot of motivation in implementing explainable AI into the models that are being built. So as of today, we've seen 3 waves of AI. The first wave of AI focused on enabling reasoning over narrowly defined problems. The problem is it lacked any learning capability, and it poorly handled uncertainty. If you think of financial products like TurboTax, QuickBooks, for example, they're able to take information from a situation where rules have previously been defined and work through it to achieve a desired outcome. However, they're unable to operate beyond those previously defined rules, so they don't take context into consideration. The second wave of AI is statistical AI. That has nuanced classification and prediction capabilities, but no contextual capability and relatively minimal reasoning capability. So major machine learning based AI platforms like Watson, Einstein are good examples, as they're able to synthesize huge terabytes worth of information and data to provide insights and answers, but aren't always able to truly understand or explain how they got to that answer. So today we find ourselves in the third wave. This is to make AI explainable and much more transparent. So AI algorithms continue to increasingly interact with humans across an array of industries, which we talked about, in our homes, our cars, even our clothing. So if they continue to evolve the way that they have been, and they continue to be black boxes in nature, there's a rationale and proven concern with transparency and trust. So to avoid these concerns, these systems should be transparent in a way that can explain their work, including assumptions they've made, the different options they've considered, and eventually why they came to the answer that they provided. Right now, there's an opportunity, particularly closing out 2020. We've seen this time and time again. There's an opportunity to establish trust between the system and the human. Explainability and transparency are starting points to something much broader. The collaboration between individuals or humans and computers to solve some of the most complex problems in the world. So when we think about the need for explainable AI, the need arises or increases with the potential cost of poor decisions. So the underlying dynamic is that as the human impact and implications of AI decisions increase, so does the need for explanation. So the quadrant map that you're looking at gives you the potential cost of poor decisions against the human participation in those decisions. So currently, the most prominent successes of AI are in the bottom left-hand quadrant, so labeled consumer, where potential cost and human participation are both relatively low. So think about areas like recommender engines and search rankings. However, as we move increasingly into the top right quadrant of decisions, including things like fraud detection, credit risk profiling, and incident investigation, as well as medical diagnoses, the potential cost rises dramatically. So in the top left quadrant, this area includes military decisions. Any mistakes are potentially catastrophic. So if AI lacks the ability to explain itself in these areas, then the risk of it making a wrong decision may outweigh the benefits it could bring in terms of speed, accuracy, and efficiencies of the decision making, which is why AI was put into place in the beginning. So we all know, we've heard time and again, that organizations have begun using AI techniques and solutions to affect outcomes across a broad range of purposes, such as approving loans, identifying fraudulent transactions, and performing surveillance. These applications often operate like black boxes for decision making. So if they produce results without explanation, they make detection of inappropriate decisions difficult. This exposes your organization to all sorts of vulnerabilities, such as biased data, unsuitable modeling techniques, and just incorrect decision-making in the algorithm lifecycle. So as algorithms become more powerful, more pervasive, more sophisticated, the methods for monitoring and troubleshooting them lag behind the adoption for the AI. So organizations should consider seeking transparency and overall accountability in how decisions are made by algorithms. Consider things like ethics, fairness, and safety in how algorithms are used, and adopt new approaches to ideally effectively manage the risk introduced by these complex AI algorithms. We've seen the effect through incidences over the last year in 2020, such as a healthcare program which was set up, witnessed backlash from patients when it replaced the manual process with an algorithmic approach that started reducing patients' medical benefits, leaving many patients, their families, and caregivers unclear about the rationale behind the decisions and leaving many in a financial lurch. We've seen it with a crime predicting algorithm that judges consulted when making sentencing determinations of convicted criminals came under scrutiny when it was found that the algorithm was no better at predicting an individual's risk of recidivism or the opportunity to reoffend than selecting a random group of volunteers on the internet, taking a survey of what they thought. And most recently, many organizations from MNCs to small medium businesses pulled their advertising from a well-known website after its programmatic advertising algorithm placed ads next to both sensitive and completely inappropriate content. So I could go on about all of the instances that we've heard over the last several years, particularly around healthcare, justice reform when it comes to algorithms. But many times, we hear about the issues of AI. However, on the flip side, we've also seen organizations implement explainable AI to both the benefit of themselves as a company, their customers, and society as a whole, including firms such as firms that we know like GE, IBM, Pinterest, to smaller ones that you may not have heard of, such as Kindi and Amandra, who are doing amazing things with leveraging explainable AI. So what does this all bring us to? Data-driven technologies like AI, when designed with ethics in mind, benefit both the business and society at large. But it's not enough to say that you'll be ethical and expect it to happen. We need tools and techniques to help us assess gaps in our ethical behaviors, to identify and stop threats to the ethical goals that we have. So we always need to know where and how to improve our ethical processes across development life cycles. What we need is a way to manage ethical risk and mitigate that ethical risk. Because organizations approach their AI in many different ways, from optimizing existing systems to building new AI to procuring third-party technologies. I want to focus next, with the rest of the time we have, on offering a framework of recommendations that will allow an organization, no matter which bucket your organization falls into, to be able to have a checklist of how to approach trustworthy AI, to approach and build trustworthy AI with explainability embedded into it as you think about implementing it within your organization, or making updates or procuring it. So one of the key elements I mentioned was trustworthy. I think language matters. So let's first define how I'm approaching the term trustworthy AI. There were really three key components here that were outlined by the high-level expert group on AI, presented ethics guidelines for how to develop trustworthy artificial intelligence. And I've given a synopsis over the next several slides about the questions to ask when building, but you can find a much more robust list of these questions and the appendix, which I believe may be sent out after this. So when we think about trustworthy, first we think about lawful, so respecting all applicable laws and regulations within your territory. So we won't really touch on that today, but it's important to mention. Ethical, so respecting the ethical principles and values that you as a society, as individuals, and as a collective within an organization believe are important. And then robustness, so both from a technical perspective, but also taking into account the social element and the environment that you're working within. Also, one important thing to note is this assessment list for trustworthy AI is ideally completed involving a multidisciplinary group of stakeholders. So these could be from within and or outside your organization, with the specific competencies or expertise on each of the 7 requirements that we'll dig in starting on the next slide, and all of the related questions that fall under each of these sections. So again, just like any beneficial conversation, having diverse stakeholders at the table, including folks like AI designers, developers, data scientists, procurement specialists, thinking about your front end staff who will actually will use and work in the system itself, all the way to legal and compliance officers. Again, this kind of touches on regulatory elements, such as if you have a compliance officer for necessity based under GDPR regulations, or individuals such as just the head of legal, and then the overall management team. So I always encourage the idea of really having individuals who not only understand the area, but also individuals at the table who could be impacted in the most severe way by the AI that is going to be implemented. So the guidelines put forward is a set of 7 requirements that AI systems should ideally meet in order to be deemed trustworthy. This assessment list of trustworthy AI is intended for self-evaluation purposes. It provides an initial approach for evaluation of trustworthy AI. And it's intended to be flexible. Every organization, as I mentioned, is different. So you can draw on elements relevant to the particular AI system from this list, or add elements to it as you see fit, taking into consideration your sector, how you operate, different compliance elements. Is it a B2B versus B2C? How large are the groups that might be affected when putting this AI system out into the wild? It also helps organizations to understand what trustworthy AI is, particularly what risks an AI system might generate, and how to minimize or mitigate those risks while maximizing the benefit of the system. It's also intended to help organizations identify how proposed AI systems might generate risks, and to identify whether and what kind of active measures may need to be taken to avoid or minimize those risks. So organizations will derive the most value by active engagement with the questions it raises, which are aimed at encouraging a thoughtful reflection to provoke appropriate action and nurture an organization's culture, which is ideally committed to developing and maintaining trustworthy AI systems. It also raises awareness of the potential impact of AI on society. So how it affects society, the environment, consumers, workers, and citizens, in particular, vulnerable groups such as children and people belonging to marginalized groups. It also encourages the involvement of relevant stakeholders, which I touched on the last slide. It helps to gain the insight on whether meaningful and appropriate solutions or processes to accomplish the adherence to these 7 requirements are already in place, or they need to be put in place and subsequently where the gaps lie. So the 7 requirements are human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, thinking about diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness, and how those 3 areas are relatively unique in and of themselves, the environmental as well as social societal well-being, and finally, which many systems lack, quite frankly, is accountability. So when something goes wrong, who's accountable for it? So let's dig in a little bit more depth across these 7 areas. So requirement 1 is looking at human agency and oversight. So AI systems should support human agency and decision-making as prescribed by the principle of respect for, let's say, human autonomy. This requires that AI systems should both act as an enabler for a democratic, flourishing, and equitable society by supporting the user's agency and upholding fundamental rights, which should be underpinned by human oversight. So in this particular requirement, AI systems are assessed in terms of the respect for human agency and autonomy, as well as human oversight. When you think about the second part, human agency and autonomy, the first part, human agency and autonomy, it deals with the effect AI systems can have on human behavior in the broadest sense. It deals with the effect of AI systems that are aimed at guiding, influencing, or supporting humans in decision-making processes. For example, algorithmic decision support systems, risk analysis prediction systems such as recommender systems, predictive policing, financial risk analysis, and so on. It also deals with the effect on human perception and expectations when confronted with an AI systems that act as though they're human. So if you think of, in its simplest forms, a bot, if you've ever communicated with Delta or any customer service application. Finally, it deals with the effect of AI systems on human affection, trust, and independence as well as dependence. So the questions that lie here are really looking at all of those areas. So specifically, could the AI system affect human autonomy by generating over-reliance by end users? And what are those implications? The second section is human oversight. So this helps to self-assess necessary oversight measures through governance mechanisms, such as human in the loop, human on the loop, and human in command approaches. So I'm sure many of you have heard these definitions before, but human in the loop refers to the capability for human intervention in every decision cycle of the system, while human on the loop refers to the capability of human intervention during the design cycle of the system and monitoring the system's operation. While finally, human in command refers to the capability to oversee the overall activity of the AI system. So this includes things like its broader economic, societal, legal, and ethical impact, and the ability to decide when and how to use the AI system in any particular situation. This last area can include the decision not to use the AI system, which is very important as well, particularly when we think about how we talked about marginalized groups, children, there are many times where the AI system may be pulled back because it's not giving the appropriate outputs needed for a particular group of individuals.
Right.
So requirement 2, technical robustness and safety. So a crucial requirement for achieving trustworthy AI is their dependability, the ability to deliver services that can justifiably be trusted, and resilience. So thinking about robustness when facing changes. Technical robustness requires that AI systems are developed with preventative approach to risk. Like any business, you want to think about risk mitigation and that they behave reliably and as intended while minimizing any unintentional and unexpected harm, as well as preventing it wherever possible. So this should also apply in the event of potential changes in an operating environment or the presence of other agents, whether they be human or artificial, that may interact with the AI system in an adversarial manner. So the questions in this section address 4 main issues: security, safety, accuracy, and reliability, fallback plans, and reproducibility. So I've only included a couple of the questions on this slide. I think there's probably about 10 in each of these particular areas, but it really is an opportunity to ask questions, particularly in the technical build stage, as well as making sure that there is safety procedures and thinking about the halo effect of those decisions on the populace. So requirement 3, this one can be closely linked to the principle of prevention of harm. Is privacy a fundamental right, particularly affected by AI systems? So prevention of harm to privacy also necessitates adequate data governance that covers the quality and integration of data used. Its relevance on the relevance in light of domain in which the AI system will be deployed, its access to protocols, and the capability to process data in a manner that protects privacy. So privacy helps to self-assess the impact of the AI system's impact on privacy and data protection, which are both fundamental rights that are closely related to each other, and to fundamental right to the integrity of the person, which covers respect for a person's mental and physical integrity. Data governance helps to assess the adherence of the AI systems in use in various elements concerning data protection. So here we're thinking about not only the privacy of the data, but the privacy of the individual and society, as well as overall data governance. So have you put things into place in any of the following measures, such as, GDPR if you're in Europe, or non-European equivalents in the US. So for instance, California, which has separate data government state laws than some of the other states in the US. So just thinking about these 2 particular areas. Requirement 4 is all around transparency. So I know I touched on transparency a little bit earlier, but it's a crucial component of achieving trustworthy AI. It's transparency, which encompasses 3 elements: traceability, explainability, and open communication about the limitations of the AI system. And I think that the latter part is sometimes overlooked. So when we think about traceability, for instance, it helps to self-assess whether the process of the development of AI systems, i.e. the data processes that yield the AI system's decision, is it properly documented to allow for traceability, increased transparency, and ultimately building that trust that we talked about earlier in AI for society. Explainability allows or helps to self-assess the explainability of the AI system. So these questions refer to the ability to explain both the technical processes of the AI system, the reasoning behind the decisions or predictions that the system makes. And explainability is really crucial for building and maintaining users' trust in the AI system. So if you have AI-driven decisions, to the extent possible, must be explained to and understood by those directly and indirectly affected. So, thinking about that, going back to eliminating that black box in order to allow for contesting of such decisions. And many times, that's the area that we lack, is the ability for an individual affected to contest the prediction or the output from an AI system. So an explanation as to why a model has generated a particular output or decision and what combination of input factors contributed to that decision is not always possible. These cases are referred to, as I mentioned before, as black boxes and require special attention. So in those circumstances, other explainability measures such as traceability, auditability, transparent communication on the AI systems may be required. So provided that the AI system as a whole respects fundamental rights, the degree to which explainability is needed depends on the context and the severity of the consequences of erroneous or otherwise inaccurate output for society and individuals. So finally, the communication area. This area specifically helps to self-assess whether the AI system's capabilities and limitations have been communicated to the users in a manner that's appropriate to the use case at hand. This could encompass communication of the AI system's level of accuracy, as well as the limitations that it knows it has, and taking those into effect when rendering or giving an output. Requirement 5 looks at diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness. So in order to achieve trustworthy AI, we must enable inclusion and diversity throughout the entire AI system's lifecycle. So AI systems usually suffer from the inclusion of inadvertent historic bias or incompleteness sometimes, or bad governance models. The continuation of these biases could lead to unintended direct and indirect prejudice and discrimination against certain groups of people, potentially exacerbating prejudice and marginalization that we see in society. So harm can also result from intentional exploitation of consumer biases, for instance, or by engaging in unfair competition, such as a homogenization of prices by means of collusion or non-transparent market. So when you think about identifiable and discriminatory biases, they should be removed in the collection phase where ideally possible. AI systems should be user-centric, designed in a way that allows all people to use AI products or services, regardless of things like age, gender, abilities, or characteristics. Accessibility to this technology for persons with disabilities, which are present in all societal groups, is of particular importance. So when thinking about accessibility and universal design, particularly in the B2C domains, AI systems should be user-centric, and designed in a way that allows all people to use AI products and services, regardless of their age, gender, abilities, or characteristics. So accessibility to this technology for persons with disabilities, which is present in all societal groups, is of particular importance. When you look at the second area, so stakeholder participation, in order to develop trustworthy AI, it's advisable to consult stakeholders. And again, the stakeholders who we talked about earlier, who may directly or indirectly be affected by the AI system throughout its life cycle. It's beneficial to ideally solicit regular feedback on an ongoing basis, even after you've deployed the AI system in the wild, and set up longer term mechanisms for stakeholders, for stakeholder participation. So for example, by ensuring workers' information, consultation, and participation throughout the whole process of implementing an AI system at organizations. Requirement 6 looks specifically at environmental and societal well-being. So in line with the principles of fairness and prevention of harm for broader society, other sentient beings in the environment should be considered as stakeholders throughout the AI system lifecycle. So think about ubiquitous exposure to social AI systems in all areas of our lives, be it education, work, or entertainment, may alter our conception of social agency or negatively impact our social relationship and attachment. So while AI systems can be used to enhance social skills, they can equally contribute to their deterioration. This could equally affect people's physical and mental well-being. The effects of AI must be carefully monitored and proactively considered. So sustainability and ecological responsibility of AI systems should be encouraged, and research should be fostered into AI solutions addressing areas such as areas of global concern, for instance, sustainable development goals. Overall, AI should be used to benefit all human beings, including future generations. So AI systems should serve to maintain and foster a democratic process and respect the plurality of these values and life choices of individuals. When we think about the technical glitch. For recommendation 7, accountability. When we think about recommendation 7, accountability, the final requirement really looks at the principle of accountability. And many times this is left out of frameworks that I've seen in organizations when they're implementing or building new AI, or particularly when they're procuring third-party AI system. The idea of this accountability factor. So really thinking about it necessitates that mechanisms be put into place to ensure responsibility for the development, the deployment, and or the use of AI systems. This topic is closely related to risk management, identifying and mitigating that risk in a transparent way that can be explained to and audited by key third parties. So when unjust or adverse impacts occur, accessible mechanisms for accountability should be put into place that offer an adequate opportunity for redress, or for individuals to come and say that they have been harmed in some way, shape, or form, and to find a solution to that harm. So there are 2 specific areas here: auditability and risk management. So auditability helps you to self-assess the existing or necessary level that would be required for an evaluation of an AI system, both internally and to external auditors. The possibility to conduct evaluations as well as to assess records on said evaluations can contribute to the idea of a trustworthy AI repository. So in applications affecting fundamental rights, including safety critical applications, AI systems should be able to independently be audited. This does not necessarily imply that information about an organization's business model or any IP related to the AI system needs to be openly available for this audit to take place. The second area for risk management gives both the ability to report on actions or decisions that contribute to the AI system's outcome, and to ideally respond to the consequences of such an outcome. These 2 areas should be ensured. So identifying, assessing, documenting, and minimizing the potential negative impacts of AI is especially crucial for those who are both indirectly and directly affected. So due protections must be available for whistleblowers, NGOs, trade unions, or any other entities when reporting concerns about an AI system. So when implementing any of the above requirements, or tensions may arise. Again, this is a framework that really is about discussion, is about challenging one another with these key diverse stakeholders at the table, and then obviously continuously looking at the system that's been built or that is running to ensure that if there were trade-offs that had to be made, that they were made in a responsible, ethical, solution-oriented way. And really bringing all of these individuals to the table to be able to discuss how the optimal AI for an organization for customers as well as for society can be implemented. And frameworks in and of themselves are not the be all end all of developing, ethical AI. But it's really about thinking about how these conversations or how these procedures can be embedded within an organization so that the proper questions are being asked, that the right people are being held accountable. And ideally, AI systems particularly are being built with explainability, interpretability, and being able to have transparency, particularly if things do go wrong, and being able to address those issues. So this framework is really ideally meant to help organizations, whether you're at the beginning stage of, the third phase of implementing explainable AI within your organization, or you are making changes to explainable AI or going through the procurement process currently. So hopefully this gives some sort of insight into what explainable AI is, why it's important, what the motivation of implementing it within an organization is, and then touching on a light framework to begin the conversation, bring the stakeholders together to the table in order to execute this. So with that, I believe I'm at time, and I will kick it back to you, Gia.
Amazing. Thank you, Nicole. We all know this is an incredibly important topic right now and appreciate you sharing your wealth of knowledge with our audience. We have a few questions that have come in already, and encourage anyone else, if you have any additional questions, feel free to submit them. So let me just dive in. We have a question from Myra. What is the most effective way to debug black box models for accuracy and bias?
Oh, how much time do we have? So I think that I don't have the depth of building AI models myself. I just want to be very transparent. One of the areas that I would say, one of the areas that I've seen for concern with clients, and particularly when data scientists have gotten together and they talk about, there have been issues that have arisen. Usually it goes back to three key areas. First and foremost, it is about the fact that they have inputs that have not been cleaned. When I say cleaned, it's data specifically that either is missing, data that is skewed. So at the end of the day, we always talk about biased data. All data is biased. It is. It just, if anyone ever says data is not biased, then they're biased. All data is biased. So it's not about it's not about data being unbiased. It's about recognizing the bias in data, understanding if that bias is going to have unforeseen consequences that are problematic in the outputs, and then making adaptations to that data in order to mitigate those outputs. So for instance, if I know that I have data that is, let's say, historical data about successful employees at a traditional MNC, right? I can guarantee you, without even cracking open most companies' data on their employees, mostly, particularly for executives, they are Caucasian men that are usually over 45 years of age, with, particular tendencies in their approach to work. So I know that data is biased, right? Because we only have a small sample of executives. Of those executives, they skew towards Caucasian as well as male. So I'm not going to eliminate that data, but knowing that that's one of the issues with the data, then there are ways to go in and to manipulate the data in order to take into account that the success factors for this data is skewed because we have limited data. So now how can we supplement this data with, let's say, more diverse data pools in order to give it a balance on predictions of what success for that organization looks for in the future? One example. So usually I mentioned three areas. So it's usually around data. So debugging, making sure you have enough data, you have the right data, and you've cleaned your data appropriately. The other area I would say when debugging a model comes into play with going back to transparency. So do you have transparency about how the model is making decisions? Do you have transparency about why it made a decision or why it did not make a decision? If you don't have that explainability or that transparency, then there's no reason that anyone inside your organization or outside of the organization should trust that model. Because again, if I, God forbid I have to fire someone, right? I don't just get to fire someone. I have to explain why they're being fired, right? There has to be, a warning. There has to be, due diligence to mitigate any of the issues with the individual. There's a process. So if that process isn't transparent, if we haven't had the due diligence put in on explaining or giving some sort of insight into why this happened, then it's a process that can't be trusted. Finally, the third area when it comes to debugging is, and again, I probably can't get into the technical element of this, but I know that's come up time and time again, is really about taking a step back and thinking about what the end goal of any system is, right? So you may not necessarily consider it a bug, but if a system works the way that you want it to work, but an unintended consequence is that a small group of individuals are adversely affected, then that's problematic, right? So it's really about also making sure like you have that feedback loop, and the feedback loop goes outside of just your target audience, but really looking at how it affects the larger society. And really thinking about what the halo effect is based on the outcomes, the target that you're hoping that these outcomes affect in a positive way, but then who are the individuals down the road that this is also affecting. So I think those, I don't know if that's necessarily answers the question on debugging, but I think those are the three of the areas that I would focus on if there are issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great feedback. Let's see, another question from Anna. Many orgs have ad hoc processes to help teams break down which features have the greatest impact on a model's outcomes. But how do they make explainability scalable and sustainable for the long term?
So I think that, scalability is, so after you've built explainable AI into the features and capabilities of the model, it's something that is part of your ongoing work cycle. I mean, just like you have development legs, just like you go back in and you ensure during updates around glitches, around areas that may need improvement. It's part of the ongoing product life cycle. Should always be feeding in updated data. If I look at an ML model that doesn't have a feedback loop and that was built in 2018, right? 2018 to 2021, God knows things are very different. And there's all sorts of data that we have now that we didn't have in 2018, knowing that, that can help systems in many different ways to improve themselves, whether it be something like a climate change model, or if it's something like a political model, or even thinking about an organization such with a recommender engine. There should be a feedback loop. There should always be a constant update. If you're looking at procuring software with AI systems and you don't see that development schedule, on an ongoing basis for an organization, I mean, ask them for it. What's their development? What's their feedback loop? How often are they making both visible and invisible updates to the system? What are those updates? Do they give you a great level of explanation? I'm one of those people, for instance, even in iTunes or even in the Apple library, when I download apps and there's an update, I always want to know, like, what's the bug fix, like, specifically, and again, not fun reading for everyone, but it's one of those areas that, if you know the harm that AI causes, then this is something that you invest time and energy into, because it not only has a huge impact on society, but it really does, as B2C companies have proven, optimizing with explainable AI, putting the time and effort in building out their teams, folks like Pinterest, explainable AI, they started building that in, I think in 2019, really blowing it out in 2019. The CMO there has, really invested time and effort and money into ensuring that, the tech team and the data scientists and the model is continuously updated. Again, it's Pinterest, a little lower stakes when it comes to AI systems. But again, even more effort, more time should be put into, AI systems that have a larger, more possible detrimental effect on society.
Yeah, absolutely. And that ties into, we have one final question that is asking about the organizations that are doing it well. So you mentioned Pinterest. And this person asked, there were other organizations you mentioned in your presentation that are doing interesting things with explainable AI. If you could repeat those names.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I mean, I always go back to GE, for instance. It's GE is not necessarily sexy, but I really think that they do an amazing job. Particularly when you think about having such large scale products, particularly around wind turbines, that once they're installed, you don't just get to pick it up and make adjustments and changes, right? So really, they've done an amazing job with, they're a business, right? Their job is to increase profit, minimize cost, and to delight customers, in its simplest form. So really, one of the byproducts of delighting customers and reducing cost is the environmental impact, right? So they have been very, very conscientious in building out their explainable AI, specifically to be able to understand when, like, a turbine has any glitches, the sensors may be thrown off based on changes in the wind, heat factors, et cetera. So if you think about some of the wind turbine farms in California, for instance, you don't have to go out and do an entire changeover of a turbine. It's really about looking at how some of the AI features have been changing over time. So looking at time series and looking at elements that they're taking into effect in order to constantly update the turbine and make them sort of more efficient, better, and really giving that information as well, having that transparency to the end client. So if you are the city of California, trust me, there are some people that are working there that are nerdy and really want to be able to crack open and understand some of the elements that are going on with wind turbines. So they give them that accessibility, that transparency, and insight into how turbines are operating, to making sure that they're operating at 100% capacity versus 90% capacity, which causes which causes a lag on the entire sorry, there's a word that they use. I'm trying to get it correct, but I'm just going to say on the entire system. But there's like a technical GE word. But so Pinterest, GE, IBM are doing an amazing job. Actually, IBM, the list that I just went through regarding Trustworthy AI, they were one of the individual organizations that worked on that list with the EU. To implement these guidelines across Europe for individuals to effectively leverage and utilize within organizations.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've introduced some excellent points here today, but unfortunately, we are nearing the end of our time. So I want to thank you once again, Nicole, for your incredibly insightful talk, and thank you to everyone who tuned in and joined us live. And also want to quickly remind everyone of our next upcoming AIG Talk on January 27th, which will be tackling data privacy with federated learning. So until then, we will see you on air soon.
Thank you so